Bronstein hasn't mentally recovered after the tragic blunder in Game 6, and Botvinnik skillfully exploits this in Game 7. In a slightly better middle game, he makes a lot of waiting moves, expecting Bronstein's patience to run out, and Bronstein falls into this psychological trap as he didn't like defending passively. He makes an impulsive move which lets Botvinnik transition to a knight endgame with an extra pawn. Botvinnik demonstrates brilliant endgame technique and wins his second game in a row. Botvinnik starts with d4, and after d5 c4 e6 knight f3 c6 g3, Bronstein chooses the Dutch defense again, f5 stonewall variation, bishop g2 knight f6 castle kingside, bishop e7 b3. The idea is to play bishop a3 and exchange dark squared bishops, which would be in white's favor. Black played d5 and f5 and seriously weakened the central e5 square, where white knight would be ideally placed. And one of the defenders of this square is, of course, dark squared bishop. And after the exchange of these bishops, the defense of e5 square and all dark squares in general would be problematic. Castle kingside, bishop a3, b6. Black, in his turn, is preparing c5 with counterplay in the center and fianchetto of the bishop. Bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, knight e5. Now, of course, as the knight is defending c6 square, knight d7 would be premature, as it would leave the pawn on c6 unguarded. So first bishop b7, defending the pawn. And after knight d2, now knight d7. Knight takes d7, knight takes d7, e3. Botvinnik defends the d4 pawn in advance, as black wants to play c5, attacking the pawn. Rook c8. Now both sides are fighting for the control over c-file. Rook c1, c5, queen e2, knight f6, c takes d. Here Bronstein writes in his annotations that he was scared of capturing with a pawn, because after e takes d, the black pawn would be on d5, on a light square. Another pawn is also on light square, f5, and the bishop is light squared bishop. So it would be limited by its own pawn, and it will be bad bishop. While white's bishop would be much more active. White bishop would attack d5, while black bishop would be forced to defend it. And after knight f3, knight e5, the knight would be dominating on e5, and black most probably would be forced to exchange this knight, knight d7, and as the knight on e5 would be intolerable. And after exchange of knights, the domination of white's bishop over black bishop would be obvious. That's why he captured with a bishop, in order to exchange these bishops. Bishop takes d5, e takes d, knight f3, knight of course is heading to e5, rook c7. So black is doubling on the c-file, and white is doing the same. Rook c8, rook c1, knight e4, knight e5. So the position is almost symmetric, with the only difference: white pawn is still on f2, while black pawn has already moved to f5, and this weakened the king side and weakened e5 square, and this gives white slight advantage. Now at first sight, c takes d is a good move for black, as it might lead to mass exchange on the c-file, and after these exchanges the position would be equal. However, Botvinnik, after c takes d, wasn't going to exchange on c7. Instead, he had a very strong move, knight c6, attacking the queen. And now if queen a3, for example, then both e takes d or even knight takes d4 would give white advantage. So the knight is greatly placed on blockading square, the pawn would be isolated, and even after queen takes c1, sacrificing the queen for two rooks, exchanging actually, white would be much better, because the knight is very strong and it controls the penetration square on c2, so the rook won't be able to penetrate on c2. Or instead of queen a3, if queen d7, then again knight takes d4, and after exchanges of rooks, white is better because of isolated pawn, weaknesses, knight is great blockader, and white also has control over the only open file. That's why in this position c takes d isn't so good. So Bronstein plays knight f6. He just makes calm waiting moves, as he doesn't have any active plan. as the position is symmetric and white is a little bit better. So all black can do is just wait. And Botvinnik in his turn does the same. Queen d3, attacking the pawn on f5, g6, queen a6, so he is waiting for Bronstein's patience to run out. King g7, queen e2, queen d6, and a4. It's a strong move. It takes under control b5 square. In case black plays c4 at some point in order to sharpen the game, b5 would be a very useful move for black in order to support the pawn on c4. But after a4, it would be impossible. And a4 also sets a trap. If black makes a natural looking move, knight d7, in order to exchange this great knight on e5, white would play knight d3, avoiding the exchange and exerting more pressure on c5. And if c4, disturbing the knight, then knight f4 would follow. And if c takes b, that would be a terrible blunder because of exchanges of the rooks and knight e6 fork. So that's why Bronstein, instead of knight d7, played knight e8, defending the rook. So the previous variation won't work because the knight is defending the rook now. And knight e8 also prevents queen a6. So if white played queen a6, then c takes d would follow, and after exchange of rooks, knight would capture on c7 with tempo, attacking the queen, and the knight is also attacked. So black would win a piece in this variation. That's why after knight e8, as queen a6 doesn't work, Botvinnik played queen d2, continuing his waiting strategy. Knight f6, queen c3, knight e4, attacking the queen, queen d3, and here Bronstein makes his first mistake, inaccuracy. It's not fatal mistake yet, but inaccuracy. He captures on d4. This opens the c file and makes the position more dynamic. And as black king isn't safe, so while white king is absolutely safe, black king isn't that safe. So the opening of c file is in white's favor. Instead of this, it would be better to either continue making calm waiting moves, or if black wanted to play sharp, it would be better to play c4 instead. And if b takes c, Bronstein gives the following variation, queen b4, for example, attacking the pawn. And now c takes d would be a terrible blunder, of course, because of rook takes c2 and queen b1 check, and white is losing the rook. And after c5, b takes c would follow, and then exchange of rooks, and the position would be equal in this case. Instead of this, Bronstein plays c takes d. Probably he expected Botvinnik to exchange on c7. Rook takes c7 check, rook takes, and after mass exchanges and queen takes d4, at first sight it looks that white is better because white is attacking the weak isolated pawn on d5, and also there is a discovered check threat. However, Bronstein prepared, in this case, queen c3, very strong move. Now discovered check isn't so scary because black will just exchange queens. Queen is also attacking b3 pawn, and if white takes on c3, of course the knight would take and the position would be absolutely equal. But Botvinnik didn't exchange rooks and just captures the pawn. Now Bronstein makes another unnecessary move, a5, weakening his queen side. It was absolutely unnecessary. King g2, Botvinnik continues his strategy, waiting moves. So just waiting, Bronstein already made two inaccurate moves, and most probably he will make even more mistakes. So there is no hurry for Botvinnik. Knight f6, queen e2, and after this another waiting move, queen e2, Bronstein finally makes much more serious mistake. He plays f4. Instead of continuing waiting strategy, he plays f4 now. Active move, however, this move is a mistake. Botvinnik in his turn also makes a mistake now. Instead of exchanging all rooks and only then capturing the pawn, and white would be just a pawn up. Although it's doubled pawn, but still it's an extra pawn, and white would be able to play f5. He, instead of this, immediately captures on f4. And this lets Bronstein actually to equalize the position, which he didn't use. He didn't use this opportunity. He played knight h5 immediately, creating a terrible fork threat, of course. But instead of this, it would be better to first exchange on c2 and only then play knight h5. You will see the difference. So now black is again threatening the fork, and white cannot capture on c8 because of this knight f4 fork. So white doesn't have time, and f4 is under attack, and it's problematic. Its defense is problematic. The queen cannot defend it, as it must defend the rook. If king f3 defending the pawn, then queen e6 would follow with terrible threats. If knight g4, for example, then that would lose on the spot. Queen e4 check, very strong move, attacking the rook, and after queen e4, d takes e comes with check, and white is just losing the rook. So after knight h5, in this case, white would be forced to play knight d3. That's the only way to defend the pawn on f4. But then just exchange of rooks and exchange of knights, and this queen endgame is absolutely equal. Black is even a little bit better. But Bronstein didn't use this opportunity, and instead of exchange on c2, he immediately played knight h5. And now Botvinnik has the chance to exchange the rooks. Although black is threatening to capture f4 with a terrible fork, rook takes c7 comes with check now. That's the difference, because if Bronstein first captured on c2, then Botvinnik won't have this opportunity with tempo capturing on c7. But now he has it, and he exchanges all rooks and plays queen g4, threatening f5 and defending f4. Knight f6, attacking the queen, queen e6. Now again f5 is threatening. Knight h5, creating again the same threat, knight f4 with a fork. However, Botvinnik finds a great solution now. He exchanges the queens. Queen d7 check. Queen takes d7, knight takes d7, attacking b6. Knight takes f4 check, king f3, knight d3, knight takes b6, and white is a pawn up now. And also d5 is under attack. Instead of knight b4, if black played knight c1 in order to play actively, counter-attacking b3, that would be a terrible blunder because of knight takes d5, knight b3, king e3, and the knight is trapped. That's why the only move is knight b4, defending the pawn. But now white is a pawn up, and Botvinnik has a very simple but effective plan to convert his advantage. He's going to move his king to c3, his knight will be rerouted to d3, attacking b4, threatening to capture on b4, and after a takes b, of course, a pawn would turn into a passed pawn. That's why, and black, if black knight captures on d3, then white will just play b4, and again, after a takes b, the pawn would be passed. That's why after king c3 and knight d3, black knight would be forced to move away. After that, white will play b4, and still the pawn would be passed, would turn into a passed pawn. However, the only concern for white is the king. White shouldn't let black king penetrate to the king side, to f4, and disturb these pawns. And Botvinnik was very good at preventing the counter play of his opponent, and you will see how effectively he implemented his plan without giving Bronstein any opportunities of counterplay. King f4, king f6, knight d7 check, king e7, knight e5, king e6, king e3, king f5. Now white wants to play king d2 and king c3. But before this, it's important, of course, to take under control e4 square, because right away king d2 would be bad because king e4. So f3, g5, and now king d2. Now king f4, which at first sight looks strong, would be a terrible blunder because it will let white play knight d3 check. Now if king takes on f3, then of course knight would take, and after a takes b, the pawn would promote. And after knight takes d3, still b4 would follow, and again white is winning. That's why, as king f4 doesn't work, Bronstein plays h5. Now knight d3, so again threatening to capture, and black cannot capture because again b4 would follow. That's why the knight is just pushed away. Knight a6, knight c5, knight b4, knight d3, so repeating in order to gain some time, more time. Knight a6, and now h3, knight c7. Now king c3, which white was planning initially, would give black some counterplay. If king c3, then Bronstein had a strong move, knight e6. And it turns out that as the knight is attacking d4, the king cannot move. And the knight cannot move either, because king f4 would follow. White is still better, but Botvinnik didn't want to give black any chances, and he would be able to play king c3 later. For now, he plays king e3 in accordance with a very important endgame rule. When in the endgame you have an advantage, don't hurry. Before making some active moves, just wait for the appropriate moment, for the best possible moment. Before that, just maneuver, make waiting moves, and when the much better time comes, then make the active move. And that's exactly what Botvinnik does. He will play king c3 when the right time comes. Knight a6, king e2, so again waiting moves, king e6. Now knight c5 check, which at first sight looks strong as it forces the exchange of knights, would be a terrible blunder because of knight c5. D takes c, king d7, king d3, king c6, king d4, and very strong move h4. And now if the king moves, then the pawn falls, and after b4 the pawn endgame would be drawish. So that's why just king d2. So now king is heading to c3. If king f5, still king c3 would come with b4, and white pawn would turn into a passed pawn. That's why king e7, but still king c3. So now it's time for king c3. Now black doesn't have any counterplay, and that's why king c3 comes in the right moment. King d6 and b4. A takes b, knight takes b4, knight c7, a5, knight b5 check, king d3, king e6, king e3, knight a7, a6, knight b5, knight c6, knight c7, knight b4, defending the pawn, king f5, a7, king e6, king f2, h4, f4, g takes f, king f3. And in this position, Bronstein resigned. I'll be grateful if you hit the like button, as it's really helpful for the channel growth, and subscribe to watch next games of this match. See you in the analysis of game 8.